I'd like to introduce Natasha Khanna-Dang, who is here with us tonight as part of her, graduate study. She did a program in the Walnut Woodland in Fuente Hills to understand how it was supporting the Avifauna of the area. And we've invited here tonight to share how she studied the area, some of her findings, that sort of thing. And she just finished graduate school. So let's give it up for congratulations and welcome. Let me just figure this out. Okay. Okay, hold on. I know how to do it.
Yeah, sure.
This one. Okay, so do this first. Let's see. And then where's the Zoom? Disappeared again. Okay, here it is. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so my name is Natasha Khanna-Dang, and I recently graduated with my master's degree in conservation biology from Cal State LA. And I'm going to talk to you not only about the ecological value of California. You can't hear me?
I'm going to turn on the mic. Sorry, darling. Try that.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay. So I'm going to not only talk about the ecological value of California walnut woodlands to avifauna.
That closer to you.
Oh. Okay. But also about how ecological research can be rooted in community. So here's a roadmap to my presentation. First, I'm going to give you background about about how my research was inspired by community efforts. Then I'm going to talk about the ecology of walnut woodlands. Then I'll talk about my research goals and objectives, the methods of my study, the results, and then a conclusion. So when I was looking for a thesis topic, I was really interested in issues of environmental conservation and how it could intersect with social justice. So I'm going to talk about how my thesis was directly inspired by grassroots organizing, in Northeast Los Angeles. So up until the early 2000s, Northeast Los Angeles was a place where working class families could afford to rent, surrounded by a lot of green space. It's like, for those of you who are from LA County, this is the part of Los Angeles that is directly northeast of downtown LA. And many of the neighborhoods were historically redlined. And that means that a lot of the open space was actually overlooked for land preservation. In addition to discriminatory loan practices for housing. So housing has now become very unaffordable, leading to displacement of longtime residents. Leading to displacement of longtime residents, and development on steep hillsides has now become very economically feasible. And the trend is to develop expensive single-family units over affordable multi-family units. Okay. And Northeast LA, the kind of habitat that you find is California walnut woodland habitat, and there's still a lot of undeveloped rolling hills. So you can see from here, there's a lot of open green space, and this is not protected habitat. It's actually parcels of land that if people wanted, they could purchase, and a lot of people have, and they can develop. So the primary tree that you find in the California walnut woodland is
the Southern California Black Walnut tree, also known as Tacape Washut. Tacape Washut is culturally important to the Gabrielino, Tongva, Quichua, Serrano, and Tataviam communities in Los Angeles County. It is also an endemic tree that you can only find in Southern California, and it has reached the point of becoming rare. It is adapted to fire, drought, and it can grow on steep hillsides. And then the walnut fruit can be used as a food source. You can eat it, and it can be used as a black dye. So when developers started to target large patches of walnut woodland, residents in Northeast LA started to mobilize, and they used a local tree protection ordinance for the walnut tree to halt development projects. And then Tacape Washut became a symbol of community resilience and resistance, and a lot of as residents started to mobilize. And this inspired residents to learn about native plants, learn how to take care of the land, and they organized restoration activities and community science surveys. And this led to the first annual Tacape Washut Black Walnut Day in 2022. So here are some activities that you can see that has happened over the past 2 years. Here at last year's Tacape Washut Black Walnut Day, which is a large celebration. This is a picture showing a community mapping activity where residents are mapping the watershed, woodland habitat, and development projects. So I found that like many community leaders, they kept mentioning that this habitat was really important to wildlife. And this really piqued my interest. So when I started to do research, I was doing research and I was in grad school, I actually couldn't find any ecological data to support this idea. So I decided to do research on how California walnut woodland habitat is important to wildlife and specifically to birds. So now I'm going to walk you through the ecological background for California walnut woodland habitat. But before I do, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so the first question is like, where did I get my t-shirt? And this t-shirt I got from last year's Black Walnut Day. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you information about this year's upcoming Black Walnut Day. There's another question in the back.
Yeah, talking about the dye. I love the smell of spring. And I work and so I spent a while like working with a lot of the leaves after about an hour and black, and it stayed that way for about a week and a half, and I looked it up and there's a lot of stuff. Walnut can be really toxic actually, and you get in the skin. I was totally fine, but I just had this moment. What was their process?
Okay, so the question is from the participant who has worked with the black walnut trees and found that it dyed their skin, if there's any toxicity in the leaves. I don't know. I have not personally like worked with the leaves, but I have seen from the walnut dye activities is that they take the walnut, they put it in water, and then they soak, I'm not sure if it's warm or cold, but they soak whatever cloth that they're trying to dye in it. And then and they used gloves. So in this way, there was like no chance you can prevent like absorption in the skin. But yeah, that's a good question. Is there any questions from the Zoom?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So now I'm going to talk about the ecological background. So the primary canopy cover that you find, specifically trees, is in California walnut woodland is the Southern California Black Walnut tree and coastlife oak. Together, these trees, if the California walnut in combination with the coastlife oak make up more than half of the canopy or close to it, it's considered a California walnut woodland. And here's like a picture from one of my study sites at Williker Park in Studio City. So the other types of plants that you could find in this habitat are toyon, blue elderberry, and laurel sumac. And so throughout this presentation, I'm gonna refer to trees and large shrubs as overstory plants. I know that a lot of foresters don't consider shrubs to be overstory plants, But in Southern California and our woodland plant communities, we don't have a lot of trees like they do in other forests. And for the purposes of my study, I'm considering it overstory plants together. So the primary geography for California walnut woodland are rolling hills. And this is an ecotonal habitat, and it overlaps with oak woodlands, coastal sage scrub, riparian habitat, and chaparral. And here's a map that shows the geographical range of this habitat. So you can see from this map that the range goes as far north as Lompoc. It goes down all the way to San Diego, and it goes as far east as the western slopes of the San Bernardino Mountains. Somebody once asked me if there's any California walnut habitat in Baja California. Even though I have not verified this myself, I think most likely there is. But then you can also see from this map that a lot of the habitat overlaps with highly urbanized areas across Southern California. And as you would expect, since the times of colonization, this habitat has been impacted first by agriculture, then land grazing, and now urbanization and climate change. So a majority of the habitat has been extirpated because of urbanization. It has also been impacted. The understory has been impacted as well. So prior to colonization, it is believed that the understory consisted of native perennial forbs and grassland species, and now it is mostly invaded by annual Eurasian forbs and grassland species. However, the overstory is seems to be mostly native species. So then I decided to focus my research on birds. And the reason why I did is because Southern California exists in a biodiversity hotspot, and LA County is one of the birdiest counties in the United States. And birds can serve as an indicator species for the overall health of ecosystems. And also, this area is like a really important part of important area for migratory birds. So here's a map that shows you the 4 flyaways in the Americas, and we here in Los Angeles County are in the Pacific Flyaway. So here's a really cool map from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that compiled a bunch of studies to show the migratory patterns of different bird species. Each dot on the map represents one species. And so you can see, here, like, I'm gonna let it just repeat itself over again, but starting in December, birds, they start to fly, as it gets cold, they start to fly north. And then in the spring and summer, a lot of migratory species, they nest in cooler areas. They spend their time there, taking care of their chicks until their chicks are ready to fledge. And then as it starts to cool down, they fly back south. And so this shows, and you can also notice from this map that actually there's not a lot of studies done on the West Coast. So, I just wanted to see what was out there. I wanted to see what kind of migratory birds are passing through California walnut habitat and whether it was important to them. So now I'm going to talk about, well, first let me ask, does anyone have any questions?
Question from the online community. They would like to see your shirt.
Oh, I can't see the camera, so I don't know how to do that.
So I think if we can. There we go. There's the shirt.
Yeah, this is a shirt. So it says Tacape Washut, which means Southern California Black Walnut, and then it's a image of a walnut and leaves.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks. Back.
Okay.
There you go. Thanks.
So now I'm going to talk about my research goals and objectives. So my primary, yeah.
Sorry, Diana Nicole, who in the chat,
yeah,
did the survey. So,
okay.
I don't know if we can unmute her.
I don't know what to do.
Diana, if Diana could unmute, can she unmute herself?
I don't know how to do these things.
No, it would be participants.
Oh, no. Did you do it?
There we are. Thank you. Hi, Natasha.
Okay, Diana,
Um,
Diana could try now to unmute,
I'm unmuted.
and I think we need to turn your speaker on.
There might be a feedback. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. I just want to clarify something because in the conservation work we do, it's really important. And that is, you know, the prime bird nesting season is really long. And so this idea that the birds hang out just until they're young fledge, well, first of all, we have some birds that breed numerous times numerous times in the bird breeding season, which is technically from February to mid-September. But birds stay around, certain species stay around the nest for weeks after they fledge. As fledglings and as juveniles until they become independent. And I just wanted to clarify that really important point. It's one reason why the bird nesting season is so long, or one of two reasons, because they have more than one clutch, but also it's important because we have a lot of people in our walnut woodlands and our oak walnut woodlands doing brush clearance and tree trimming and all kinds of disruption, thinking that the birds have fledged. And we just had a situation in Elysian Park where a red-tailed fledgling was squashed under a skid steer because it couldn't get out of the way in brush clearance. So just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Diane, for clarifying that. Yeah, in California, unlike other parts of the United States, say like the East Coast, where they have a true winter, there is a longer season for nesting. Yeah, that is absolutely true. Okay, so my research goal was to quantify the ecological value of California walnut woodland habitat to birds in Los Angeles County along an urban to natural gradient. So in order to do this research, I had three objectives. The first one was to quantify the composition of trees and shrubs and birds in the habitat. So pretty much, what are the trees and shrubs out there in the habitat, and what birds are using them? My second objective was to quantify relationships between various components of the plant community during the fall and spring periods of the annual bird cycle, which Diane just clarified. So what that means is, like, I wanted to see, is there a relationship between abundance of native plants and foraging birds? Is there a relationship between non-native plants and foraging birds? What about urban density? Does that have an impact on birds? And I will share the results from that objective. And my third objective was to quantify the feeding behavior of birds during the spring and fall periods to distinct trees and shrubs. So when I was out there, I really noticed the phenology. So I saw that a lot of plants, they flower in the spring and they fruit in the fall. And we have different migrants that come and stay with us in the spring and the fall. So I wanted to see how the birds were using it. I imagined that they were using different species, they were using species differently at different times of the year. And I wanted to see what the data showed. So does anyone have any more questions before I move on? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the methods. So I had 8 sampling sites, and they fell along an urban to natural gradient. So my most urban sites were in Northeast Los Angeles, and so the 2 sites were El Rio and Debs Park. And then I had suburban sites, and these are the ones on the further east. There's one up here in Glendora. Then I have one in West Covina, and then one in Puente Hills, where we went. 2 weeks ago we had our bird walk. And then I have my most natural site is in Santa Clarita in East Canyon. And then I have these two unique sites, Griffith Park and Williker, which are in the city of Los Angeles, but they are connected to large spaces of open space, specifically the Santa Monica Mountains. And so I did tree and shrub surveys. I did one survey per each site. I had a pre-planned trail where I surveyed the trees and shrubs within 30 meters of the trail. I identified the trees, I counted stems, and I measured the diameter at breast height. And I specifically focused on trees and shrubs that were taller than 2 meters. And this is because that's what I found that the birds were mostly feeding on. Like there had to be enough foliage, enough flowers, enough fruits for the birds to feed on. And then I conducted bird foraging surveys. So just to quickly walk you through this diagram here, showing the annual cycle of birds, which this is a diagram that, you know, it's just generally speaking for the whole United States. And as Diane has clarified, it's a little bit different for Southern California, but just generally speaking, birds migrate north in the spring and migrate north in the starting in the winter spring, and then they start breeding in the spring and summer. And for my purposes, I'm considering this my breeding season. And then they migrate south starting in fall and winter, and this is considered the non-breeding season for me. So I had 5 surveys per site. I did 3 surveys during the breeding season, and I did 2 surveys during the non-breeding season. And I didn't just document every single bird that I saw. I actually focused on documenting birds that were foraging off of the trees and shrubs. So I identified the birds, the foraging behavior, and the species they were foraging on. And I'm not going to go into too much detail for the statistical analysis. I'm just going to give you a brief survey. So first of all, I obtained LA County parcel data. So that's geographical data that you can get from LA County. And that's pretty much like data that shows all the buildings or parcels that exist in LA County. And I can use this as a way to measure urban density. And then for my statistical analysis, I use general linear models. And then I wanted to also calculate how prevalent or dominant the tree and shrub species were on the landscape. And I calculated importance values, specifically using the counts of stems and then also how big each of the tree or shrubs were. And then I used the bird foraging data to calculate feeding percentages. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah, exactly. So like it was easy to count the trees, and what I did is like I designed my study based on people who had done similar studies in forests where they were just counting trees and just measuring the diameter at breast height for the trunk. But here in our woodlands, if I did that, I would pretty much eliminate the tree that piqued my curiosity, which is the Southern California Black Walnut tree, which when it grows, it can have multiple stems. And this goes also for a lot of the shrubs. So I would count the stems and I would also measure the diameter breast height, but only for those that were more than 2 meters tall. So I didn't count every single like tiny little sapling that was growing. Yeah, okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, most of the bird species, it would seem like this study would be designed towards insectivorous bird species.
Absolutely, yes. So the question is this study designed for insectivorous bird species? And yes, that is totally designed for that. However, I did capture, which I'm going to go into the results, but I did capture some birds that ate fruits in the fall. I will say though, it is much easier to capture observations of birds feeding on insects than fruit. I feel like I would have had to design a different study where I would have to stand under an individual shrub or tree for like 45 minutes to get 1 or 2 observations. So, you know, which was not feasible for me. Yeah. Another question? Go ahead.
Were there any trees or enjoying it? Have you seen any trees that really old?
Yeah, I did. I saw a lot of old coast live oak and black walnut trees. Okay, so the question is, did I see any old black walnut trees? Yeah, I think yes, I did. There's like 3 or 4 sites that stand out in my memory. I remember Elleria Canyon in Northeast LA had a really large black walnut tree, which I was surprised to see in this like highly urbanized neighborhood. And then I also saw another one in Galster, which is in West Covina, and is also right next to a landfill. Yeah. But also I want to just say that I was staying on the trail and I didn't go deep into the dense shrubs. So I just document what I saw from the trail.
Do you remember any in East Canyon?
I can't really remember actually there being a lot in East Canyon, no.
So, Brian Gonzalez in the chat mentioned, he's been surveying coast live oaks in East Canyon, and there's a plethora of beautiful black walnuts there.
Yeah, I don't, maybe Brian has seen some. Okay. But I'm gonna go in my results, and I saw a lot out there, so I don't really remember. Sometimes it's a blur in my mind. So let me walk you through the results, which hopefully will answer more of your questions. So for my first objective, which was to figure out the composition of trees and shrubs, I had over 17,000 observations. So it's a blur. I really can't really remember. Sometimes I remember the big ones that stand in my mind, and then there could totally have been big ones that if I go back into my data sheets, I could find. So I'm going to talk, so I had actually came across 49, I documented 49 species of trees and shrubs in the habitat. And here are the top 5 trees. So here, this is what I'm talking about. I calculated the importance value for each tree and shrub. So Southern California Black Walnut, it was the most prevalent on the landscape. So you could say its importance value is around 26%, followed by coast live oak, and so on. And then I want to just say that of the 49 species that I documented, 22 were native and 27 were non-native. So, but even though I documented more non-native, about 86% of the overstory vegetation consisted of native trees and shrubs. So that is the majority of the landscape. So it was really interesting to see that's even though this habitat is so impacted, there's the majority of the canopy that you find there is native. So then I wanted to figure out what were the birds. You know, this was like the biggest question, like curiosity for me. What was I going to find out there? So I had over 1,000 observations of foraging birds. I documented 49 species total. Of the 49, 48 were native. 26 of them are resident birds that you find all year round in California walnut habitat. 11 were breeding species that I saw in the spring and summer, and 8 were non-breeding species migrants that I saw in the fall. So those two, the last 2 are specifically migratory species. And if anyone's wondering what was the one non-native species I saw, it was a red-whiskered bulbul, and it was in Elleria Canyon, which is like a very small park surrounded by a lot of like houses with backyards. So that's probably why I saw it over there.
So, I'm not sure on this table.
Uh-huh.
Your year-round species, all of them have to breed here.
Yeah, they do breed here.
That are they only migratory, but they're migratory, but breed here?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, what the 28 year-round species, yes, those species are resident birds. That means that they're here all year round, and it means that they breed here as well.
The other one, the other 11 are breeding here only and leave.
Yes, and the other 11 come here in the spring and summer, and they breed here, and then they leave in the fall. And the 8 are passing through, yes.
And unless you saw any nests in the Woodlands, California duck.
Yes, even though I didn't do a nesting survey, I did come across house wrens nesting in cavities of black walnuts. Are there any other questions? Go ahead.
Being the majority of the overstory are native shrubs and trees.
Why are the question is, why are the majority of trees and shrubs native? Yeah, okay, so the question is, like, why do I think I saw like the majority composition, like the 86% to be native, even though there were way more not like non-native species there, and that's, I think that it would have been majority 100% native species if humans didn't introduce those species. So like places, for example, like Debs Park, it's a park managed by the city of LA, and they're managing it however they want, potentially planting, and they are planting non-native plants for whatever purposes. You know, so Griffith Park is the same like that as well. And I will say that I do think that most of the non-natives, I was only doing my surveys along trails, and I think most of the non-native species that I observed were like close to parking lots, closer to the more busier parts of the trail, or like by picnic areas.
The spin count a lot higher, also not with native plants, that was with non-native, even though the species count is higher with non-native.
Yeah, so
So that's why canopy was covered by native, because you have far more native.
yeah. Yeah, the clarification from audience member is that there's just more abundance of the native species on the landscape, even though we documented much more variety of non-native species, like just the individual species versus abundance or dominance on the landscape. Yeah.
Is that probably mostly a function of the 2 meter height restriction that your bigger shrubs are native that you experience in your smaller field, or you know other species?
The question. Okay, so the question is that a function of me specifically focusing on trees and shrubs that are taller than 2 meters? And I would say no, I don't think so. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
2 questions from the online community. One is asking, how long did it take you?
Take me to do the whole study? It took me 2 years to do the whole study, but like if you're talking about just the survey period, I started my surveys in May and I concluded them in December. And initially I was only going to do a spring survey because that's the bare minimum I needed to graduate, but I really thought that the fall would show something different. And I'm going to get into those results. Yeah, any other questions?
There's a comment in the online that the city of LA Record Parks mostly plants non-native trees because they don't know how to manage native species.
Okay. All right, anything else? Okay, I will move on. Oh yeah, and then 2 species were migratory species, meaning they were just passing through. They don't stay for the spring or fall, but on their migratory journeys, they stop, they rest, they eat, recuperate, and then they fly on. So now I can't share all 49 species, but I will share the top 6 species that I found foraging. And here you go. The most common bird that I found was the bush tit, followed by the yellow-rumped warbler, which is a migrant that comes in the fall. Then oak titmouse, it is a bird that is in decline. And primarily because of urbanization or human encroachment on habitat. Then the blue gray gnatcatcher came in fourth, followed by California towhee, who's also a year-round resident, and the Nuttall's woodpecker, that is a resident and also endemic specifically to Southern California. So now I'm going to talk about my second objective, and that was to quantify relationships between environmental attributes and bird foraging behaviors. I had over 20 significant models, and I'm going to focus on 5. So here, this graph is showing the relationship between non-native tree and shrub count and total bird feeding count. So let me just, for those who might, need a refresher in stats, I'm going to walk you through this graph. So the x-axis here shows you the count of non-native trees. The y-axis shows you the count of feeding birds, and each of the dots were one of my sites. Okay, so here it's telling you that as non-native tree and shrub count increases, bird counts go down. And this R-square value of 0.7171 means that 71% of the model likelihood is explained by this model. That's very high. Instead, I learned in college, if you get a value of 0.25, you're happy. So this is really, really crazy high. And also I found, I wasn't sure, this was all theoretical, like the urban to natural gradient, where my site's going to fall along an urban to natural gradient, and it did. So Debs is one of the most urban sites that I have, and you can see it has a very low count. And then East Canyon was the most natural, and then South Hill is up there as well. So generally speaking, it falls along an urban to natural gradient. And here, this graph shows the relationship between native tree and shrub richness and bird feeding richness. So as native tree and shrub richness increases, so does feeding bird richness. And what does this mean? So richness is the number of species. So as the number of native tree and shrub species increases, so does the number of bird species. And this is like a measure. We use species richness as a measure of biodiversity. So pretty much it's saying that if you have high biodiversity in the habitat, then you're gonna have high bird biodiversity as well. And I also ran a lot of models on the top 5 trees that I had mentioned to you before, and blue elderberry came as very significant, statistically significant to birds in the spring. So here, as blue elderberry count increases, so does the foraging bird count in the spring. And in the fall, I found coast live oak was really statistically significant. And again, this is really showing the urban to natural gradient. East Canyon is the most natural site, has the highest count, and Debs, the most impacted by urbanization, has a low count. And for those of you who went, Powder Canyon is pretty high up there for coast live oak. And here is the final model that I want to show you. And this is showing you the relationship between urbanization and feeding birds in the fall. So as the number of parcels, so what I did is I counted the number of parcels within a 10-kilometer radius of each site. So as the number, and I used GIS, I didn't do this manually, but as the number of parcels around each site increases, the number of birds feeding, the bird count goes down. And I really wanted to do this because my research was inspired by anti-gentrification efforts in Northeast LA. And I really wanted to use ecological science to show that urbanization development is not good for this habitat. So next I'm going to talk about my final objective, and that is to quantify tree and shrub use by foraging birds. So specifically, I wanted to see how were the birds using different trees and shrubs across seasons. So there's a lot going on in this bar chart, so I'm going to slowly walk you through this. This bar chart compares the proportions of trees, the availability of trees and shrubs to feeding birds. So the green bar is actually the importance value that I walked you through earlier. So this is showing that the Southern California has the highest important value of around higher of 26%, followed by coast live oak, and so on. And then the brown bar is the total feeding percentage. So this is telling you, for example, with coast live oak, because the brown bar is taller than the green bar, birds are using this tree in higher proportion than it is available on the landscape. And you can say the same for blue elderberry and western sycamore. And then when you look at laurel, toyon and laurel sumac, when you compare the green to the blue, they're using it about in similar proportions that is available. And for black walnut, they're using it in a lesser proportion than it is available. So let's look at the spring feeding and the fall feeding. So you can see that coast live oak is very important in the spring. So is toyon. It's used in higher proportion than it's available in the spring. And then laurel sumac is very important in the fall, and so is blue elderberry. And so this is showing me something that my regression models couldn't show, and that's why I did this type of analysis. And just I guess, does anyone have any questions before I move on? Okay, go ahead.
How did you monitor the bird? Did you stay in one place or travel on a trail for how long?
The question is like, how did I count the foraging birds? And what I did is that I had a pre-planned route at each of my sites, and I walked. And as I walked, I would just stand at a place for no more than 5 minutes and look for birds. Usually I would stop when I would hear a bird or see a bird, and then I would stop, wait until, if I heard it first, usually I would hear it first, then I would wait until I saw it, and then wait until I saw the foraging behavior. And then I started to figure out, there's some birds that I'm not going to see foraging because they're foraging in the understory, but they perch on the top, whereas I know that there's specific species that are known to forage, is insectivorous species that forage in the overstory vegetation, and so I would make sure to stop to get that. Okay, is there another question?
So it's interesting to go
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What did you witness? What did you witness happening with flowers?
Okay, the question is that it's interesting to see that toyon has a higher feeding percentage in the spring than the fall, and what was the phenomena that I was witnessing. So I think because I was focusing on insectivorous birds versus specifically, I think the study design would have been different if it was on fruit eating birds only. And a lot of insectivorous birds do eat fruits too, though. So because I was focusing on that kind of behavior, yes, I saw a lot of insects in the spring on the flowers. And then like I said earlier, like I did see birds feeding on the toyon, but it's just like required way more time to stand under one shrub. And so also for the toyon, like the toyon is a shrub that goes all the way to the ground. Whereas a coast live oak, you can stand underneath the tree and look up. I can't stand underneath the toyon and look up. I have to look through the shrub, try to see the behavior. So all of these things combined makes it hard to observe the birds eating the fruit, even though I feel like they're eating the fruits a lot. I just wasn't able to capture it in my study. Okay, there's two. Should I go to that one first, Cliff's question?
Could you distinguish between birds eating insect presence compared to birds collecting insects to feed their young?
The question is, did I distinguish between birds eating the insects themselves versus capturing them to feed to their young? No, I did not, because I could not follow the birds to their nest. And that wasn't part of the study design. Okay.
I'm gonna continue there for a moment and say that in my experience of gardens and I experienced, before I knew what toyon was, I called it the lunch tree. Everything was in there eating, but Ptolemy has said that rose species, particularly pruners, are very high in, for caterpillars. And And so, toilet being in the rose family may contribute to, a higher percentage than we might think of, in birds eating insects.
I'm trying to remember everything you said. I'm sorry. Okay. All right.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So, I would just say rose friendly species, are often used by tadpoles.
Oh, okay. So orchid common is that rose species are often used by caterpillars, and toyonism, the rose species. So it's also considered a really important, like a lunch plant, a plant that a lot of birds and other animals feed off of.
Good. There's another question online, if asking you to please repeat what you said about the green and brown bars on the graph.
Okay, so
talk to the colors.
the colors. Okay, I'm gonna walk through the colors again. So the green bar is really just capturing the availability of trees and shrubs on the landscape. So Southern California black walnut is the most abundant or prevalent on the landscape, followed by coast live oak, toyon, laurel sumac, and then blue elderberry and western sycamore. And then the other three bars are capturing feeding percentages. So I'm comparing the green bar, the availability of the tree shrub on the landscape, to the feeding bar, to the other three bars, which is feeding percentages. So the brown bar is the overall feeding percentage throughout both the spring and the fall. And then the purple and the orange bar is the feeding percentages in the spring and the fall. So purple is feeding in the spring, and then orange is feeding in the fall. And yeah, so you can see here that the top six trees and shrubs are all native, and coast live oak and blue elderberry and western sycamore in particular are fed on overall in higher proportions than it's available on the landscape. And then there's different results for spring and fall for the different species. And I will say that even this research was very much inspired by the Southern California black walnut. And so I was disappointed that the brown, purple, and orange bars are lower than the green bar, but it is so abundant on the landscape that the bars are still pretty high. They're being fed on by a lot of species. And then I did a similar thing now, just counting all the native species combined to non-native species. The bars being exactly the same thing as the previous slide. And this shows that native species by far are very important to feeding birds, and they are fed on birds on in a higher proportion than it's available on the landscape. Does anyone have any questions about this one? Okay, and finally, I want to show you the numbers of foraging birds that fed on each of these 6 species. So here it's showing that the Southern California black walnut was fed by the highest number of bird species. And you know, so this just shows you that it is an important tree in the habitat. I think it's kind of like a generalist tree. It provides a different habitat for different insects at different times of the year, and so different birds are using it throughout the year. Does anyone have questions about this one? So now I'm going to talk about my conclusion. So first of all, California walnut woodland is ecologically valuable to native birds. It is worthy of conservation. It supports a wide variety of native birds. The overstory vegetation is important for bird biodiversity. And it's really important to do ecological studies across seasons. I wouldn't have found out that laurel sumac was important in the fall. And I will say for laurel sumac, it was really important for yellow rump warblers, a migratory species. And yeah, so so a lot of the master students, they'll just focus on one season because they need to graduate on time. But you know, like doing multiple seasons will show different results. And urban density strongly impacts birds in California walnut woodland habitat. So what are some takeaways for me as an ecologist doing research that's inspired by the community? I think it's really important that if you want to do this kind of work is to actively participate in the community to build trust and relationships. And if you're going to do research that supports their goals. And as an ecologist, a lot of us are trained in science, and it's really important to also educate yourself on the social justice and environmental justice issues that concern the community. I really think if you know, if this is something that interests you, I encourage you to do this. We need more biologists and ecologists doing research that supports issues interested to communities of color, to communities that have been historically underserved. So I would like to thank my advisor who really guided me and helped me think about how to design the study, Dr. Eric Wood. He was my advisor, and I worked in the Wood Lab of Avian and Urban Ecology at Cal State LA. I would like to thank my classmates who helped me with some of the bird foraging surveys, Harnawaz and Jessica. And then finally, for all the financial support from the Cal State LA University, from CNPS Los Angeles, Santa Monica Mountains, Pasadena Audubon, Palos Verdes, South Bay Audubon, and Santa Monica Bay Audubon Society. And I would also like to acknowledge that this research was directly inspired by the Tekape Washut Northeast LA Black Walnut Day Committee. And here's a list of all the committee members. So you can see it's like a really, really large grassroots community with many different types of organizations who really are seeing the intersections of not only doing environmental conservation work, but also addressing issues of anti-gentrification and issues of social justice. We're having our upcoming Black Walnut Day on September 22nd. If you're interested in getting updates, here's a QR code you can use. If you just want to get the updates for the event, just check that box. You don't have to participate, and you can participate at whatever capacity you have. And also, if you'd like to get updates on Instagram, you can follow Koyoto Masawali. And then finally, does anyone have any questions? So here, go ahead.
First, like the patience with someone question, it sound like the committee challenging, but not really. Many of us hiking in bird, see toyons all over Christmas, January and February, full of berries. And it just appears that very few birds use them. Once in a while, see the rats and dollars and use them. It's almost like all that food is just sitting there. I would say more often than not, it's even dry out.
So Mickey Long, who is the rare plant expert, says that the toyons fruit up until November, December, and is full of fruit. And for considering how much fruit you see on the shrub, that it's really not used as much as by the animals as you would think. Occasionally by cedar waxwing, and you've seen it in other species. I've seen California thrasher feeding. That's one of my observations on there. Okay, anyone else? Okay, go in the back.
The walnuts are the winter deciduous. You seem to have a lot of activity in the winter. How is that?
Okay, so the question is, walnuts are winter deciduous. How's that the case that you have a lot of activity in the winter? So actually, I started my surveys in, I want to say end of April, May, early May, and ended in December. And I think winter technically starts at the end of December. So really, it's like I was capturing birds in the fall. Yeah. Another question? Say that again. What part? The question is, what part of Griffith Park was my study site? It was like the trail that starts kind of close to the old zoo. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned
kind of like a literature review before you started your project. In that review, did you find other research regarding California walnut woodlands and development? And then a follow-up would be, do you have any future research with regards to walnut?
Okay, so the question is, when I was doing a literature review in the beginning stages of my thesis, did I come across a lot of literature written on California walnut woodland habitat and development in general? And the second question is, do I plan to do more research moving forward on this topic? So I came across a lot of the research that was like on the anatomy, on the botanical value of the tree. I didn't actually, and they did talk about development, but I will say a lot of my sources, you know, a lot of my sources were from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then maybe the 90s. And there was nothing and not a lot done in the last 20 years, really. Yeah, I see Diane has her hand raised and she talked about her study. So you could potentially, you could look at that study. I did read that study by the report, by the way, Dan. Yeah, and in terms of my future goals, I really am trying to get a job now as a biologist or ecologist. I'm not planning to go back to get a PhD. So if somebody wants to pay me to do that work, I will happily do it. Yeah. Okay. Should I go in the back first or? Okay. Okay. Go ahead in the back.
I think it's really very interesting to see what your found native urban areas.
Surprisingly, what? Okay.
All on the trees and those areas are and wondered if you could just say something about the value that you see in terms of how that particular presence of that native categorizing, I think you said there. About the strategy of using that for conservation purposes in suburban areas, it seems like it's quite an interesting question. And especially if there's a lot of big
You mean what is the strategy for conservation? Is that your question?
What I think you say at the beginning of your presentation was that it was recommended and turn some of those non-conservation preserved protected areas into protected. It seems like a very interesting strategy. And I wonder if you could comment if you've heard about the possibility of using that strategy in other regions.
Okay, yes.
Or even in other sub-areas in Northeast, there's like different areas where there's a lot of different.
Okay, so the question is that, well, the comment is that it's very interesting that community members were using the tree ordinance in Northeast LA to prevent development, and if I could elaborate more on that kind of strategy for conservation. So I will say that I don't think that the regulations is strong enough to protect the habitat. And what they were doing is using the City of LA tree ordinance that has a list of trees that are protected, including the walnut. But what I found was from talking to the, like, for example, Coyote Masawali, who really has engaged in litigation against developers in Northeast LA, is that what happens is that if you want to develop in an area, you can cut down the black walnut tree and you can just replace it with another tree. And it doesn't even matter if the black walnut tree is 50 years old and has a large diameter at breast height, or if it's a skinny tree. And so what they're really asking the City of LA to do is to, if you're going to cut down a walnut tree, you have to cut it down, replace it with another black walnut tree. And you also have to, and they're also asking like to consider the size. So if it's a large mature tree, maybe you should plant 50 trees. I don't know the exact numbers, so don't quote me on that. And you have to consider things like that. And they were trying to use the tree ordinance in combination with the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, to make sure that when people were doing mitigation, they were doing that. So far, they used it to halt the development, but from what I understand, they were not successful. I'm not sure where it is right now with the law. Where's the lawsuit right now? So that is an issue. And so that for me, it's like, okay, I see that Coast Live Oak, everyone knows that's an important tree, it's protected. And people know, generally speaking, even if they don't know the law exactly, that if you should not cut down a Coast Live Oak tree. And then when you look at the ecological research, you find that there's so much research done that shows how important it is to wildlife, how it supports an entire food webs and ecosystems. And so I saw that it was lacking for the California walnut tree, and I wanted to like start somewhere. I can't focus on all wildlife out there, but let me start with birds and pass the baton to someone else who might want to study another group or think about another angle to show that this tree or this habitat is important.
And Diana Nicole would like to speak. She says she can answer the
Okay.
ordinance question.
Okay, so I'll. I just unmuted.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Hey, thanks again. So I've been working with Neela for about a decade on this issue and the issue of the black walnut. So to answer the question about the protected tree ordinance, the protected tree ordinance is an inadequate code for our California walnut, oak walnut woodlands. It focuses on tree specimens. It doesn't really protect the trees. It's just a permitting process. I'm also work with a CEQA attorney. I'm a CEQA expert, and I've been helping folks like Neela with lawsuits. Unfortunately, there's been a few lawsuits, but I think the one that might be the person in the room might have been asking about is the one with Eastern Lombardy, and that lawsuit was not successful, unfortunately. And so we saw, or we'll be seeing, the removal of a 5-acre walnut woodland. And we're seeing the city permit the removal of walnuts or walnut woodlands or oak walnut woodlands at the rate of about 1 every week. And for folks who don't know, the protected tree ordinance in the city of Los Angeles, which includes Juglans californica and some other native trees, is just a process to request a permit. You are asked to plant back at 4 to 1 replacement trees. Those are not mitigation trees, so they are not protected in perpetuity, and the planting of those replacement trees are optional. And what we do see is very horticulturally and biologically unsound planting plans if they were to even be executed or implemented in the first place. So I sponsored the walnut report that I can put in the chat if people are interested back in 2022 for this very reason, that we're having an issue, and that issue being the loss of our walnut woodlands, our oak walnut woodlands, and the fact that the city of Los Angeles and other cities are categorically exempting the projects that are removing these woodlands and in urbanizing these areas. What happens when you categorically exempt this? It means there's no environmental review, there's no mitigation, and then what we're left with is the city's inadequate protected tree ordinance. Planting back replacement trees does not replace an entire woodland, because there's more to the woodland than just the tree. And that's an optional process anyway, and meaning that the applicant cannot plant the trees back, and then they lose a bond, which is usually around $20,000. For most developers, that's just the cost of doing business. So we have a real problem with conservation. And back in 2022, about this time that year, we did meet with CNPS, Nick Jensen and someone else to try and get CNPS to support having the walnut listed. Because if it's a listed species, then it has to go through, it can't be categorically exempted under CEQA. And that's the best way we can conserve our walnut woodlands. And unfortunately, we were turned down. And so one of the reasons I'm here, because I'm familiar with your presentation, your great presentation, Natasha. It was good to see it again, though. One of the reasons I'm here is to urge this chapter to support asking the folks up in Sacramento at CNPS to prioritize listing the Juglans californica as a listed species.
Well, I know it's listed as a rare, it's considered it's on their rare plant list, and it has like a ranking. What listing are you asking for again?
It has a ranking, but it is not listed official, and it has a ranking under CDFW's vegetation alliances. However, the city of Los Angeles and other cities are saying that they have a different opinion. So it has to be listed species, and it's not listed as an endangered species at this time.
Into that, in that,
Want to just come here and
so, in order to get it listed, someone would really have to do the work to document the threats. Can't just be rare, must be threatened. So this is, a good step. All this work is a good step. But there are many, many, many species that, have like a population somewhere where it could be just wiped out with one project. And so I'm not going to speak to how CNPS prioritizes these things, but often at the state office, they're trying to save the last one of something, or the one and only population that lives on one ridge somewhere that someone wants to put windmills on. So this kind of work can further that and make it more possible to create an alliance that is willing to do it. But there needs to be this kind more of this kind of work. So in an ideal world, we would pay Natasha to do the threat analysis, which, this is just kind of a step 2. Thank you.
Yeah, can I respond to that, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
So just, I guess, 2 things. First of all, yeah, that's what our paper does talk about. And we did start that process with some spatial mapping. I agree with Orchid, more mapping needs to be done. But the second thing I want to say is the time to start fighting to save a species. And in this case, we are talking about an entire alliance. This is not just one species, meaning just the tree. These trees are part of an alliance of plants, of a community. But the time to worry about saving them is before they become the last one. And so that's why and there is a lot of work to do, and that's why you have to start it sooner than later.
Yeah, I agree with you, Diane.
I mean, Natasha, you've pointed out some really important things about this.
Okay, thanks, Diane. There's like a few people who have their hands raised, so I'm gonna move on. Yeah, I just want to say I agree with it. That's why I did a study not just on the tree, but the entire community.
Yeah, and I just say last thing, thank you so much for recognizing the gentrification connection with this.
the city of LA's tree protection ordinance is absolutely inadequate. However, they are also constantly applying it illegally because they are trying to use it in ways that the law isn't written. The law needs to be improved so that they can use it to actually protect trees. They're now trying to use it to protect trees that in ways that the law isn't written. So they lose the lawsuits because the law is not written that way. The law needs to be improved in order to win the lawsuits to protect the trees. And I'm fighting both sides of that argument all the time with the city of LA. Right? In some cases, I'm
So
saying.
let me just stop. Okay, it's really hard for me to yeah, that would be better. If anyone has long comments, like just come up here and
Okay, this is Ty Garrison. Most of you know me. The first problem that we have here is, first of all, I'm going to say I agree entirely that the oak walnut woodland is absolutely special and important to preserve. The city of LA and their ordinance is poorly written, and the city is trying to improperly apply it, and that's why they lose their lawsuits. And when they're trying to, they come in and they say they ask for mitigation for trees that the ordinance already establishes what you have to do to replace the trees, i.e. the 4-to-1 or pay the bond. Once someone's done that, they've met the obligations that the city has codified. There is no mitigation beyond that legally, and that's why they lose their lawsuits. Second thing is, as we know it now, the state would never list the Southern California Black Walnut, i.e. because like Orchid said, we don't have a documented threat to it. And it certainly isn't high on the priorities when we have hundreds of species that are down to their last population. And so it won't happen on a state level from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Therefore, it's highly unlikely that the California Native Plant Society is going to put a whole lot of effort into it at this time. If we can get a threat documented that's adequate to indicate that the species is actually threatened with, elimination, we might be able to get it listed. But right now, that's not going to be a priority on anybody's list. And the third thing is a question, and that is the oak twig borer is decimating large stands of walnuts or the walnut twig borer, excuse me. I don't know why I said oak, that's a different one. And I was wondering if you saw any of that evidence and if you saw more bird activity in trees that had the beetles in them.
yeah, I wasn't looking for the beetle, so no.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so question in the back, if you want to go with the hat first.
The whole can of worms, so I'm just asking you this question, Natasha. But I imagine everyone here loves birds. Everyone on Zoom loves birds. But I'm spending a lot of time in Santa Clarita, and my mind is kind of blown at the type of people that I'm meeting in terms of openness to non-human-centric approach to reality. And so I just would like to hear your articulation of what's the importance of having an abundance of diversity.
The question is what's my opinion on having the importance of bird abundance and diversity in the world. I mean, I think I look at it overall like as the entire like ecosystem and nature, and just see like, we're in the sixth mass extinction, and we need nature to survive. We're part of it, and I've always been passionate about the environment and nature, and so yeah, I think it's important. Birds are important, but so is all of other types of wildlife as well, besides humans. Yeah. Okay, there's a question in the back.
Is there a city, a country that has more than
I guess the question is there a city, state, or a country that has an ordinance that, or a model that we could use to conserve nature or different species? That's a question I actually don't know, so I mean, I open that to the audience.
Speak to that and say that the best model for that is the county oak woodlands management plan. And we would need something like that for the whole alliance. LA County Oak Woodlands Management Plan. And Ty and I both sat on that.
Yeah, we were. Huge effort. 30 people meeting over the course of 2 years to put together the plan and get it accepted by the county. But it's a very good plan. The conservation and
Yes, and it was paid for, I mean, we didn't get paid, but the plan was paid for by the State Wildlife Conservation Board. So that would be, I feel the direction to go in would be to start lobbying the State Wildlife Conservation Board to push for that kind of plan.
but the only reason it happened. Section of both books. What's the specific definition? But there is a specific definition. And it requires counties, not cities, just unincorporated counties to protect both woodlands. Because that state requirement was there, then the various counties had to come up with a way to implement that state requirement. And well, no, we got to apply for grant, get the grant, and that's how we got the support. That actually really serious. The emphasis behind it was state legislation that both woodlands in particular.
All right.
Oh, so you were asking me where I got my definition. I went to the CNPS Vegetation Alliance manual online, and that's how I got my definition for the California walnut woodland.
That's another thing that the city of LA is trying to implement, voice upon people is they're calling things both woodlands without a definition. I mean, excuse me, walnut wood, without a definition of walnut wood. And legally that doesn't apply. We all kind of know what a walnut woodland is in our mind, but when you don't have a legal definition, you can't ask someone to, mitigate for the loss of that you don't have a definition.
Yes, so I'm saying that there's not a legal definition for a walnut woodland, or at least the city is not referring to, like they're just calling anything a walnut woodland and not really referring to these alliance manuals. Actually, I found it was really hard to find walnut woodlands out there. A lot of, it's like I was driving around all over the place, and I needed to find study sites that had enough walnut trees, but also diversity in trees and shrubs. And then when I finally did the and I saw the definition is like where it says that about where 30%, where more than half of the tree canopy is walnut woodland, or in combination close life oak is like together they make more than half of the canopy. And finally, when I did my survey, and I got that importance value of 26%, that 26% is not close to 30, it's not 30, and it's not close to 50 in terms of importance value or dominance on the landscape. And so I really wonder if there's I don't know if there's a lot of habitat out there where more than half of it is walnut trees. So maybe somebody needs to revise that. Oh, okay. Okay.
Environmental rules, California. We had a lot of problems with that. I think we have best environmental.
So I guess like if anyone has comments for the Zoom folks, like come up here and say them, because it's hard for me to repeat, but any other.
I want to read like two comments from the Zoom audience. A couple of people said, fascinating, thank you so much for sharing these findings with us. And another person says, so glad we were able to see this amazing presentation. We can tell that you fell in love with your subject. I'm sure that when you did your presentation for your master's, the committee that was blown away. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wait, are we ending it or I saw some more questions? Okay. If they're short, I will relay it.
Yeah, the black walnut, the black walnut trees were more important than
Sorry.
the oaks, but we have more knowledge. There's more protection with like so just why we have more protection for oaks. Walnut, I know it's no problem. Anything that stood out to you, like why we just don't have knowledge.
I think that there's just like, first of all, like oak woodlands, they exist beyond Southern California. There's many different types of oak woodlands out there, and people have done a lot of research over the decades to show how it's important, like how it's in terms of soil science, plant, like what's underneath the soil, insect community, like it's just like there's just so much extensive knowledge to really prove that it's like a foundational species. And this is like so niche, this is like so like specific to Southern California. And then I know there's other walnut trees out there, but you know, it's just not as there's just not a lot of research on it. And I don't think that if somebody did all the research, I still think coastlife oak would be considered more important to wildlife based on the research other than to walnuts, but I still think it's really important. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank Natasha and give her a hand that work. Thank you.